18-year-old girl wrongfully convicted of brutal murder. 16 years later, scientists find this in the evidence. An 18-year-old woman from rural Nevada becomes the prime suspect in one of Las Vegas's most horrific murders after defending herself against a rapist weeks earlier, leaving investigators with a confession that was never actually a confession. But 16 years later, forensic entomologists examining the crime scene evidence discover something so shocking and scientifically impossible that it would completely destroy the prosecution's case and prove what family and friends knew all along: she was innocent. The case of Kirstin Blaise Lobato represents one of the most devastating wrongful convictions in modern American history, a case where a young woman's fight for survival against a sexual predator would be twisted into evidence of murder, where police would ignore obvious suspects to pursue a teenager with no connection to the victim, and where the absence of tiny insects would ultimately become the key to freedom after 16 years behind bars. This is not just another case of mistaken identity or faulty eyewitness testimony. This is a case where the very evidence that should have proven innocence was overlooked for more than a decade, where scientific facts were ignored in favor of a rushed conclusion, and where a phone call based on rumors would destroy a young life. But it is also a case that demonstrates the incredible power of forensic science when properly applied, the resilience of the human spirit when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances, and the importance of never giving up the fight for truth. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how easily it could have been prevented. The real evidence was there from the beginning. The science that would eventually free Kirstin was available in 2001. The alibi witnesses were ready to testify. The timeline never made sense. Yet somehow, a teenager from a small Nevada town would spend the prime years of her life locked away for a crime she did not commit, while the real perpetrators walked free. The murder itself was brutal beyond description. The victim, Duran Bailey, was found behind a bank in Las Vegas, beaten, mutilated, and left to die. The crime scene was so violent that even experienced investigators were shaken. Someone had tortured this man before killing him, and the perpetrator had removed his genitals in what appeared to be an act of rage or revenge. It was the kind of crime that demanded justice, the kind of case where pressure to solve it quickly could lead to devastating mistakes. When detectives received a tip about a young woman who had defended herself against a rape attempt by cutting her attacker, it seemed like the break they needed. The similarity between the crimes, both involving genital injury, appeared too coincidental to ignore. But what investigators failed to realize was that they were dealing with two completely different incidents, separated by time, location, and circumstances, involving different perpetrators and different victims. Kirstin Blaise Lobato was just 18 years old when her world collapsed. She had grown up in Panica, Nevada, a tiny town with fewer than 800 residents, where everyone knew everyone, and violent crime was virtually unknown. She was a typical teenager, working part-time jobs, hanging out with friends, and occasionally visiting the bright lights of Las Vegas 3 hours away. She had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no connection whatsoever to the man whose murder would consume her life. The evidence that would eventually free her was microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, and yet more powerful than any fingerprint or DNA sample. It was evidence defined not by what was present, but by what was absent. It was evidence that required specialized knowledge to interpret, evidence that would take 16 years to properly analyze, evidence that would ultimately prove that everything investigators thought they knew about this case was wrong. The absence of blowfly eggs on Duran Bailey's body would become the most important evidence in this case, more significant than witness testimony, more conclusive than forensic analysis, more powerful than any confession. These tiny insects, which arrive at a death scene within minutes and lay hundreds of eggs in the wounds and orifices of a fresh corpse, were nowhere to be found on Bailey's body when it was discovered. This absence told a scientific story that was impossible to ignore, a timeline that made Kirstin's involvement literally impossible, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 16 years. But this case is about more than just bad science or rushed investigations. It is about the devastating human cost of wrongful convictions. About a young woman who lost her youth, her freedom, and nearly her sanity to a system that failed her at every level. It is about family members who never stopped believing, who never stopped fighting, who spent their savings and their energy trying to prove what they knew in their hearts. It is about lawyers who took on a seemingly hopeless case, and scientists who looked at evidence everyone else had ignored. Most importantly, this is a case about survival. Survival of a sexual assault that could have ended in rape or murder. Survival of a legal system that was determined to convict regardless of the evidence. Survival of 16 years in prison for a crime she did not commit. and ultimately survival of a spirit that refused to be broken, a determination to prove innocence that never wavered, and a faith in justice that was finally rewarded. To understand how Kirstin Blaise Lobato became the prime suspect in a murder she did not commit, we must first understand the incident that put her on law enforcement's radar. It was an incident that should have been seen as evidence of her courage and resourcefulness, but would instead be twisted into something dark and incriminating. It was an incident that saved her from becoming a victim, but ultimately made her one anyway. Panico, Nevada, where Kirstin grew up, is the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and children play in the streets without fear. Located in Lincoln County, about 3 hours north of Las Vegas, this small farming community has a population that hovers around 800 people. It is a place where everyone knows their neighbors, where family names go back generations, and where the most serious crimes are usually property disputes or minor thefts. It was not the kind of place that prepared a young woman for the dangers she would face in the big city. Kirstin was 18 years old in the spring of 2001, working various part-time jobs and enjoying the freedom that comes with graduating from high school in a small town. She was known as a responsible, hard-working young woman who stayed out of trouble and helped support her family. Her father had given her a small knife for protection, the kind of practical gift a father gives to a daughter who might find herself alone in unfamiliar places. It was a decision that would save his daughter's life, though neither of them could have predicted the consequences that would follow. In late May of 2001, approximately 2 months before the murder that would change her life forever, Kirstin was visiting friends in Las Vegas. It was a typical trip for a young woman from rural Nevada, a chance to experience the excitement of the city, to shop, to see shows, to experience life beyond the small town where she had grown up. She was staying at a motel, enjoying what should have been a safe and fun getaway. It was during this visit that Kirstin experienced what would become the most traumatic and consequential event of her young life. She was attacked by a man in the motel parking lot, a stranger who attempted to rape her in broad daylight. The details of this assault are difficult to recount, but they are essential to understanding how a victim became a suspect, how an act of self-defense became evidence of murder, and how the criminal justice system could go so terribly wrong. The attack happened suddenly, and without warning. Kirstin was alone in the parking lot when the man approached her. What started as what might have seemed like a casual encounter quickly turned violent as the man grabbed her and began to assault her. She later described feeling terrified and helpless as this stranger attempted to force himself on her, his intentions clear and his strength overwhelming. But Kirstin was not helpless. Remembering the knife her father had given her for protection, she managed to reach it and defend herself. In the struggle that followed, she struck out at her attacker, slashing at him in the groin area before breaking free from his grasp. The man fell to the ground, and Kirstin ran to her car and drove away as quickly as possible. As she looked back, she could see her attacker on the ground, apparently injured but alive and moving. This act of self-defense saved Kirstin from what could have been a rape, or worse. It was a moment of quick thinking and courage that protected her from becoming another statistic, another young woman victimized by a predator. It should have been the end of a terrifying experience, a story of survival and self-reliance that she could eventually put behind her. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare that would last 16 years. In the days and weeks following the attack, Kirstin did what any traumatized young woman might do. She told people about what had happened. She spoke to family members, friends, and acquaintances about the assault, describing how she had been attacked and how she had defended herself. She was clear about the timeline, explaining that it had happened in late May, at least a month before July. She was clear about the location, describing a motel parking lot. She was clear about the outcome, explaining that her attacker was alive and mobile when she left the scene. These conversations were not confessions of murder. They were the natural responses of a trauma victim processing a frightening experience. They were accounts of survival, not guilt. They were descriptions of self-defense, not premeditated violence. But in the telephone game that small towns are famous for, these accounts would be transformed, distorted, and ultimately weaponized against the very person they should have protected. Kirstin's family and friends in Panico listened to her account with sympathy and support. They were proud of her for fighting back, relieved that she had escaped unharmed, and angry that such a thing had happened to someone they cared about. They encouraged her to report the attack to police, but like many sexual assault victims, Kirstin was reluctant to relive the trauma through an official investigation. She wanted to put the incident behind her and move on with her life. What Kirstin did not know was that someone had been listening to these conversations with a different perspective, someone who would later contact police with a version of events that bore little resemblance to what actually happened, someone who would transform a story of survival into evidence of murder, a tale of self-defense into a confession of guilt. The people of Panica, who knew Kirstin well, never doubted her account of the attack. They knew her character, her history, and her nature. They knew she was not capable of the kind of violence that would later be attributed to her. They knew the difference between defending oneself against a rapist and committing premeditated murder. They would become her most important witnesses, her strongest supporters, and her unwavering advocates throughout the ordeal that was to come. But their voices would be drowned out by the rush to judgment that followed, their testimony dismissed in favor of a narrative that fit the needs of investigators under pressure to solve a horrific crime. The truth about what happened in that motel parking lot would be lost in a system more interested in closing cases than finding facts, more concerned with convictions than justice. The attack in the motel parking lot was real, the self-defense was justified, the survival was miraculous, but the interpretation of these events would become the foundation for one of the most tragic wrongful convictions in modern American history, a case where the victim's courage would be transformed into evidence of guilt, where survival would be punished as if it were murder. On the evening of July 8, 2001, as the sun set over the neon landscape of Las Vegas, a horrific discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy an innocent young woman's life. The discovery was made behind a Nevada State Bank building, in a parking lot that should have been safe, in a location where businesses operated and people worked every day. What was found there that night would shock even experienced investigators and create pressure for a quick resolution that would ultimately lead to tragic consequences. Duran Bailey was a homeless man in his 40s who had been struggling with the harsh realities of life on the streets of Las Vegas. Like many homeless individuals in a city built on dreams and fantasy, Bailey lived in the shadows of the glamorous casinos and hotels, surviving day to day in a world that preferred to ignore his existence. He was known to various social service agencies and law enforcement officers, a familiar face in a population that often remained invisible to tourists and residents alike. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, Bailey's body was discovered by someone passing through the parking lot behind the bank building. The scene that greeted the first responders was one of extreme violence and brutality that suggested this was not a random crime, not a robbery gone wrong, not a simple assault that had escalated beyond control. This was something far more personal, far more vicious, far more calculated. Bailey had been beaten with such force that his skull was cracked and his eyes were swollen completely shut. Several of his teeth had been knocked out of his mouth, scattered around the crime scene like broken pieces of evidence. His carotid artery had been severed, causing massive blood loss that would have made survival impossible even if medical help had arrived immediately. But perhaps most shocking of all, his genitals had been completely removed, an act of violence that suggested either extreme rage or calculated revenge. The crime scene told a story of prolonged suffering and deliberate torture. This was not a quick killing, not a death that came swiftly. This was the work of someone who wanted Bailey to suffer, someone who had a personal reason for inflicting such extreme violence, someone who was sending a message through the brutality of their actions. The removal of his genitals was particularly significant, suggesting that the motive might be related to sexual violence or perceived sexual wrongdoing. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department detectives who arrived at the scene were immediately struck by the level of violence displayed. Even in a city where violent crime was not uncommon, this level of brutality was unusual. The systematic nature of the injuries, the location of the body, and the specific targeting of Bailey's genitals all suggested that this was not a random act of violence, but something far more personal and premeditated. The initial investigation revealed several important facts that should have guided the direction of the case. Bailey had been living rough in the area around the bank building, sleeping wherever he could find shelter and surviving however he could manage. He was known to frequent the nearby apartment buildings, sometimes seeking handouts or temporary shelter from residents who took pity on his situation. He was also known to local business owners and security guards, some of whom considered him a nuisance or potential threat. What investigators discovered during their initial canvass of the area was particularly significant, though it would later be largely ignored in the rush to pursue other leads. Just 1 week before his murder, on July 1, 2001, Bailey had committed a violent sexual assault against a woman who lived in an apartment building directly adjacent to the bank where his body would be found. This assault was not a minor incident or a case of mistaken identity. It was a brutal rape that left the victim traumatized and terrified. The woman Bailey had assaulted was a resident of the apartment complex who had encountered him on several previous occasions. Like many residents in the area, she had sometimes given him food or small amounts of money, treating him with the kind of basic human compassion that many people show toward the homeless. But Bailey had apparently misinterpreted her kindness as something more, or had simply decided to take what he wanted regardless of her consent. The rape occurred in or near the apartment building where the woman lived, in an area she should have felt safe, during a time when she was simply going about her daily life. Bailey overpowered her, sexually assaulted her, and then made a threat that would prove to be prophetic. He told her that if she reported the assault to anyone, police, family, friends, or neighbors, he would kill her. It was a threat delivered with such conviction and menace that the woman initially remained silent, terrified that Bailey would follow through on his promise. But fear eventually gave way to anger and a desire for justice. On July 5, 2001, just 3 days before Bailey's body would be discovered, the woman finally found the courage to report the assault to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. She provided a detailed account of the rape, identified Bailey as her attacker, and expressed fear that he might assault her again or carry out his threat to kill her if he discovered she had reported the crime. The timing of this report is crucial to understanding what should have happened in the investigation that followed. Police were now aware that Bailey had recently committed a violent sexual assault against a woman who lived directly adjacent to where his body would be found. They knew that he had threatened to kill her if she reported the crime. They knew that she had reported it anyway, just 3 days before his death. They knew that she had friends and neighbors who were aware of the assault and angry about what Bailey had done. Any competent investigation should have immediately focused on the obvious suspects: the woman Bailey had raped, her friends who knew about the assault, her neighbors who had heard about the threat, and anyone else who might have been motivated to seek revenge against Bailey for his crime. The location of Bailey's body, directly behind the apartment building where his victim lived, should have been seen as highly significant. The removal of his genitals should have been understood as likely connected to his sexual assault of the woman just 1 week earlier. These were not subtle clues that required extensive investigation to uncover. These were obvious, documented facts that pointed clearly toward a revenge killing motivated by Bailey's sexual assault of the woman. The perpetrator was almost certainly someone who knew about the rape, someone who had access to Bailey in the area where he was killed, someone who was angry enough about his crime to inflict the kind of brutal punishment that was found at the scene. But instead of pursuing these obvious leads, instead of investigating the people who had both motive and opportunity to kill Bailey, instead of following the evidence where it logically led, investigators would soon receive a phone call that would send the entire investigation down a completely different path. A phone call based on rumors and misunderstandings. A phone call that would transform a victim of sexual assault into a suspect in a murder case. A phone call that would begin one of the most tragic wrongful convictions in modern American history. The real killers of Duran Bailey, whoever they were, probably never imagined that their crime would destroy the life of an innocent teenager from a small town 3 hours away. They probably never knew that their act of vigilante justice would result in 16 years of wrongful imprisonment for someone who had never even met their victim. They walked free while Kirstin Blaise Lobato paid the price for their crime, a miscarriage of justice that would take 16 years and groundbreaking forensic science to correct. On July 20th, 2001, nearly 2 weeks after Duran Bailey's brutalized body was discovered behind the Nevada State Bank building, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department received a phone call that would change the entire direction of their investigation. It was a call that should have been carefully investigated and corroborated before any action was taken. It was a call based on third-hand information, rumors, and misunderstandings. It was a call that would destroy an innocent young woman's life. The caller was a resident of Panaca, Nevada, the small farming community 3 hours north of Las Vegas where Kirstin Blaise Lobato had grown up. This person had not witnessed any crime, had no direct knowledge of any criminal activity, and had never spoken directly to Kirstin about anything related to the Bailey murder. Instead, the caller was reporting something they claimed to have heard from another Panaca resident, who had allegedly heard something from someone else, who had supposedly heard something from Kirstin herself. This telephone game of rumors and half-remembered conversations should have been treated with extreme skepticism by experienced investigators. Third-hand information is notoriously unreliable, particularly when it travels through multiple people over a period of weeks. Details get changed, timelines get confused, and context gets lost. What might have started as an account of self-defense against a sexual predator could easily be transformed into something entirely different by the time it reached police ears. that the content of the phone call seemed too significant to ignore. According to the caller, they had heard that Kirstin Blaise Lobato had told someone that she had cut off a man's penis in Las Vegas. Given that Duran Bailey had been found with his genitals removed, this seemed like information that needed to be investigated immediately. The similarity between the crime and the alleged statement appeared too coincidental to dismiss. What the investigators should have done at this point was conduct a careful and thorough investigation into the allegation. They should have interviewed the caller in detail, determining exactly what they had heard, from whom they had heard it, and when these conversations had taken place. They should have traced the information back to its original source, interviewing each person in the chain of communication to understand how the account might have changed as it passed from person to person. They should have investigated Kirstin's background, determining whether she had any connection to Duran Bailey, any history of violence, any reason to be in Las Vegas on the night of the murder. They should have verified her whereabouts during the time period when Bailey was killed. They should have examined whether there was any physical evidence linking her to the crime scene. They should have approached the situation with the caution and skepticism that any responsible investigation requires. Instead, they immediately drove 3 hours from Las Vegas to Panaca, apparently convinced that they had found their suspect based solely on a third-hand rumor. This rush to judgment would prove to be one of the most catastrophic mistakes in the history of American law enforcement, a decision that would cost an innocent young woman 16 years of her life and nearly destroy her family in the process. When detectives Thomas Thousand and James LaRochelle arrived at the Lobato family home in Panaca, they were not approaching the situation as an investigation into a potential lead. They were approaching it as if they had already solved the case and were simply there to collect their suspect. This mindset would color everything that followed, making it impossible for them to objectively evaluate the information they were about to receive. The detectives told Kirstin that they knew she had recently been attacked, apparently referring to the sexual assault she had survived in the motel parking lot in Las Vegas. This approach was psychologically manipulative, designed to make Kirstin believe that the police were there to help her, that they were investigating the crime against her rather than suspecting her of committing a crime against someone else. What followed was a recorded statement that would be used to convict Kirstin of murder, despite the fact that nothing in her account matched the basic facts of Duran Bailey's killing. The disconnect between what Kirstin described and what had actually happened to Bailey was so significant that any objective listener should have immediately realized they were dealing with two completely different incidents. Kirstin described an attack that had occurred in late May, repeatedly telling the detectives that it had happened at least a month ago. Bailey was killed on July 8th, which would have been approximately 6 weeks after the incident Kirstin was describing. The timeline did not match, but the detectives either did not notice or chose to ignore this discrepancy. Kirstin described the location of her assault as a motel parking lot, not the area behind a bank building where Bailey's body was found. She described defending herself against a rapist who was trying to assault her, not approaching someone with the intent to harm them. She described her attacker as being alive and mobile when she left the scene, crying and moving around on the ground, not beaten to death and mutilated as Bailey had been. Most significantly, Kirstin described a completely different set of circumstances than what had occurred in the Bailey murder. She was the victim in her account, defending herself against a sexual predator. Bailey was the perpetrator in his case, having committed rape just 1 week before his death. The situations were not just different, they were opposite in almost every relevant detail. But the detectives heard what they wanted to hear. When Kirstin expressed remorse about injuring her attacker, apparently believing that the police were telling her he had died, they interpreted this as a confession to Bailey's murder. When she described cutting her attacker in the groin area to escape his assault, they saw this as evidence that she had removed Bailey's genitals. When she showed emotion about the possibility that someone had died as a result of her actions, they viewed this as guilt rather than the natural compassion any decent person would feel. The interrogation was a textbook example of confirmation bias in action. The detectives had arrived convinced that Kirstin was their suspect, and they interpreted everything she said through that lens. They asked leading questions, made assumptions about her responses, and failed to investigate the obvious inconsistencies between her account and the known facts of the Bailey murder. Based solely on this recorded statement, the detectives arrested Kirstin for the murder of Duran Bailey. They did not wait for any corroborating evidence. They did not investigate whether she had been in Las Vegas on the night of the murder. They did not attempt to find any physical evidence linking her to the crime. They did not even verify the basic facts of her account to determine whether it matched the known details of Bailey's death. The arrest of Kirstin Blaise Lobato for the murder of Duran Bailey was based entirely on a misunderstood phone tip and a misinterpreted statement from a traumatized sexual assault victim. There was no physical evidence, no witness testimony, no forensic analysis, and no motive. There was only the word of detectives who had decided she was guilty before they ever met her, and who twisted her account of surviving a sexual assault into evidence of committing murder. This rush to judgment would have devastating consequences not just for Kirstin, but for the cause of justice itself. While she sat in jail awaiting trial for a crime she did not commit, the real killers of Duran Bailey remained free. The investigation into the obvious suspects, the rape victim and her associates, was abandoned in favor of pursuing a case against someone who had no connection to the victim and no motive to harm him. The prosecution of Kirstin Blaise Lobato for the murder of Duran Bailey was built on a foundation of assumptions, misinterpretations, and wishful thinking rather than solid evidence. As the case moved toward trial, it became increasingly clear that the state had no physical evidence linking Kirstin to the crime, no witnesses who had seen her in Las Vegas on the night of the murder, and no coherent motive for why an 18-year-old girl from rural Nevada would brutally kill a homeless man she had never met. What they did have was a recorded statement from a traumatized sexual assault victim who had been led to believe that police were investigating the crime against her, not accusing her of committing a crime against someone else. They had the testimony of detectives who were convinced of her guilt despite the obvious inconsistencies between her account and the known facts of the Bailey murder. And they had a community that was demanding justice for a horrific crime, even if that justice came at the expense of an innocent person. The first trial began with the prosecution facing a seemingly impossible task, convincing a jury that Kirstin had committed murder based solely on a statement that did not match the crime in any significant detail. To accomplish this, they would need to ignore the timeline, dismiss the location discrepancies, and somehow convince 12 people that a young woman describing her survival of a sexual assault was actually confessing to murder. The defense, meanwhile, had what should have been an unshakable case. They had numerous family members and neighbors who could testify that Kirstin was in Panaca on July 8, 2001, 3 hours away from where Bailey was killed. They had witnesses who could verify that she had told them about her sexual assault in late May, weeks before Bailey's murder. They had the obvious fact that her account of what happened bore no resemblance to the known facts of Bailey's killing. What they did not have, however, was an understanding of how powerful a false confession could be in the hands of skilled prosecutors. How willing a jury might be to overlook inconsistencies when faced with the horror of Bailey's murder, and how difficult it can be to prove innocence when the system is determined to find guilt. The prosecution's strategy was simple but effective. Focus on the similarities between Kirstin's account and Bailey's murder while ignoring all the differences. They emphasized that both incidents involved genital injury, that both occurred in Las Vegas, and that Kirstin had described using a knife to defend herself. They played her recorded statement repeatedly, allowing the jury to hear her express remorse about potentially causing someone's death, even though that remorse was based on her belief that her rapist had died, rather than any knowledge of Bailey's murder. The defense presented witness after witness, who testified that Kirstin was in Panaca on the day of Bailey's murder. Family members, friends, and neighbors all confirmed that she was 3 hours away from Las Vegas when the crime occurred. They testified about her character, her lack of any history of violence, and her reputation as a responsible and caring young woman who would never be capable of the kind of brutality that had been inflicted on Bailey. But the prosecution had an ace in the hole: the testimony of their medical examiner regarding the time of Bailey's death. According to the state's expert, Bailey could have died as early as 4 o'clock in the morning on July 8, potentially 24 hours before his body was discovered. This timing, if accurate, would have placed Bailey's death at a time when Kirstin's alibi witnesses could not account for her whereabouts. This time of death estimate was crucial to the prosecution's case, because even they acknowledged that Kirstin was in Panaca by 11:30 in the morning on July 8. If Bailey had died during the evening hours when his body was discovered, Kirstin's innocence would have been conclusively established. But if he had died much earlier, during the pre-dawn hours when Kirstin was not accounted for by witnesses, then her guilt remained a possibility. The defense challenged the medical examiner's conclusions, arguing that the time of death estimate was speculative and unreliable. They pointed out that determining time of death is an inexact science under the best of circumstances, and that the conditions under which Bailey's body was found made any precise estimate impossible. They argued that the prosecution was relying on questionable science to overcome the fundamental problem that their client had a solid alibi for when the murder most likely occurred. But the jury was faced with a difficult choice. On one hand, they had compelling alibi evidence that suggested Kirstin was nowhere near Las Vegas when Bailey was most likely killed. On the other hand, they had what appeared to be a confession from the defendant herself, recorded by police just days after the murder. The fact that this confession bore little resemblance to the actual crime seemed less important than the fact that it existed at all. The first trial ended in conviction. Despite the alibi evidence, despite the lack of physical evidence, despite the obvious inconsistencies between Kirstin's account and the known facts of Bailey's murder, the jury found her guilty. The recorded statement had proven more powerful than logic, more convincing than witness testimony, more compelling than common sense. Kirstin was sentenced to life in prison, a devastating blow to her family and friends who knew with absolute certainty that she was innocent. The conviction was appealed, and after years of legal battles, a new trial was ordered. But the second trial would prove even more disappointing than the first. At the second trial, the prosecution refined their strategy and strengthened their case. They had learned from the weaknesses exposed in the first trial and were better prepared to counter the defense's arguments. The defense, meanwhile, was working with limited resources and facing a system that seemed determined to validate the original conviction regardless of the evidence. The second trial resulted in another conviction, this one even more devastating than the first, because it seemed to confirm that the system would never acknowledge its mistake. Kirstin was again sentenced to prison, this time with even less hope that the truth would ever emerge. Her family and friends were devastated, her legal team was discouraged, and the prospect of spending the rest of her life in prison for a crime she did not commit seemed increasingly likely. For 16 years, Kirstin Blaise Lobato lived with the knowledge that she was innocent of the crime for which she had been convicted. She watched other inmates come and go, saw guilty people serve their time and return to their lives, while she remained trapped by a system that refused to acknowledge its mistake. She maintained her innocence throughout this period, never wavering in her insistence that she had not killed Duran Bailey, never accepting a plea deal that might have reduced her sentence in exchange for admitting guilt. The trials of Kirstin Blaise Lobato represent everything that can go wrong with the American criminal justice system. They show how confirmation bias can overwhelm evidence, how pressure to solve cases can lead to rushed judgments, and how the power of a false confession can override logic and reason. They demonstrate the tragic consequences that result when investigators decide on guilt before examining evidence, when prosecutors prioritize convictions over truth, and when the system becomes more concerned with validating its decisions than correcting its mistakes. But they also set the stage for one of the most remarkable reversals in the history of American jurisprudence. A case where cutting-edge forensic science would finally provide the evidence needed to prove what Kirstin's family and friends had known all along. The trials were a devastating failure of justice, but they were not the end of the story. After 16 years of failed appeals, exhausted legal options and growing despair, the case of Kirstin Blaise Lobato was about to be transformed by a branch of forensic science that most people had never heard of. Forensic entomology, the study of insects in criminal investigations, would provide the key to unlocking a case that had seemed hopeless, offering scientific proof of innocence that was impossible to ignore or misinterpret. The breakthrough came when Kirstin's legal team, now including attorneys from the Innocence Project, decided to examine an aspect of the evidence that had been overlooked for more than a decade. They began working with forensic entomologists, scientists who specialize in understanding how insects colonize dead bodies and what their presence or absence can tell us about the circumstances of death. What these experts discovered would completely destroy the prosecution's timeline and prove that Kirstin could not possibly have been involved in Duran Bailey's murder. Forensic entomology is based on well-established scientific principles that have been refined through decades of research and practical application. When a person dies, particularly outdoors in warm weather, their body immediately becomes attractive to various species of insects that feed on decomposing organic matter. The first insects to arrive are typically blowflies, which have an extraordinary ability to detect the chemical signatures of death from remarkable distances. Blowflies begin arriving at a death scene within minutes of death occurring, sometimes even before the person has completely died, if they are severely injured and producing the chemical signals that attract these insects. Once they arrive, female blowflies waste no time in laying their eggs, typically depositing hundreds of eggs in the body's natural openings such as the mouth, nose, and eyes, as well as in any wounds or injuries that provide access to internal tissues. The eggs laid by blowflies are easily visible to the naked eye and are present in enormous numbers when death occurs outdoors in warm weather. These eggs develop into larvae within hours, creating unmistakable evidence of insect colonization that any investigator should be able to observe and document. The absence of blowfly eggs on a body found outdoors in summer conditions is extremely significant, indicating that death occurred very recently, within a few hours at most. Dr. Neil Haskell, Dr. Gail Anderson, and Dr. Leon Lampe, three of the world's leading forensic entomologists, were asked to examine the evidence from Duran Bailey's crime scene and provide their expert opinions about what the insect evidence could tell them about the time of his death. What they discovered was so significant that it would completely overturn everything investigators thought they knew about the case. When Bailey's body was discovered on the evening of July 8, 2001, it was carefully photographed and examined by crime scene investigators and medical personnel. These photographs and reports would later prove to be crucial evidence, though their significance would not be understood for 16 years. The documentation clearly showed that Bailey's body had no blowfly eggs on it whatsoever, despite being found outdoors in Las Vegas in July, when temperatures were well above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The absence of blowfly eggs on Bailey's body was scientifically impossible to explain if he had died many hours earlier, as the prosecution's medical examiner had claimed. Dr. Haskell examined the weather conditions in Las Vegas on July 8, 2001, including temperature, humidity, and wind patterns. He determined that these conditions were ideal for blowfly activity, with temperatures warm enough to support rapid insect reproduction and humidity levels that would not have inhibited insect activity. Under these conditions, Dr. Haskell concluded, blowflies would have found Bailey's body within 15 to 30 minutes of his death and would have immediately begun laying eggs in his wounds and body openings. The extensive injuries Bailey had suffered, particularly the removal of his genitals, would have created numerous sites that would have been extremely attractive to egg-laying females. The absence of any eggs indicated that Bailey had died at most 2 to 3 hours before his body was discovered. Dr. Anderson, approaching the evidence from a different methodological perspective, reached the same conclusion. She examined not only the weather conditions but also the specific location where Bailey's body was found, the urban environment of Las Vegas, and the known behavior patterns of blowfly species common to the southwestern United States. Her analysis confirmed that the absence of blowfly eggs was inconsistent with death occurring many hours before discovery. Dr. Lampe provided the third independent analysis, focusing particularly on the temperature data and the documented condition of Bailey's body when found. His expertise in the relationship between environmental conditions and insect colonization patterns led him to the same conclusion as his colleagues. Bailey had died very close in time to when his body was discovered, making the prosecution's timeline scientifically impossible. The three experts were unanimous in their conclusions, and their reasoning was based on well-established scientific principles that had been validated through decades of research and thousands of criminal investigations. This was not speculative science or theoretical analysis. This was the application of proven methodologies to clearly documented evidence. The implications of this entomological evidence were staggering. If Bailey had died close in time to when his body was discovered around 10 o'clock on the evening of July 8th, then he was killed at a time when even the prosecution acknowledged that Kirstin was in Panica with her family, 3 hours away from Las Vegas. The scientific evidence made her involvement in the murder literally impossible. But the entomological evidence was not the only scientific proof that the prosecution's timeline was wrong. The defense also presented testimony from Dr. Klaus Ewers, a forensic pathologist who had carefully reviewed the autopsy findings and crime scene photographs. Dr. Ewers focused on the documented changes in Bailey's body between the time it was discovered and when the autopsy was performed the following day. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles that occurs after death, follows predictable patterns that can help determine time of death when properly analyzed. Dr. Ewers examined the documented progression of rigor mortis in Bailey's body and concluded that the changes observed were consistent with death occurring in the early evening hours of July 8th, supporting the entomological evidence and contradicting the prosecution's timeline. The convergence of entomological and pathological evidence created an overwhelming scientific case for Bailey's death, occurring many hours later than the prosecution had claimed. This was not a case where different experts disagreed about interpretation. This was a case where multiple independent scientific analyses all pointed to the same conclusion, using different methodologies but reaching identical results. For the first time in 16 years, Kirstin had scientific proof of her innocence that was impossible to dismiss or misinterpret. The evidence was not based on witness testimony that could be questioned, alibis that could be challenged, or character references that could be ignored. This was hard science, based on well-established principles, applied by leading experts in their field, reaching conclusions that were scientifically irrefutable. The forensic entomology evidence did more than just contradict the prosecution's timeline. It exposed the fundamental flaw in the entire case against Kirstin. The prosecution had always known that their case depended entirely on the medical examiner's time of death estimate, because without that early timeline, Kirstin's alibi would have been unshakable. Now they were faced with scientific evidence that their timeline was not just wrong, but scientifically impossible. The presentation of the entomological evidence marked the beginning of the end for one of the most tragic wrongful convictions in modern American history. After 16 years of maintaining her innocence, after countless failed appeals and dashed hopes, Kirstin Blaise Lobato finally had the scientific proof she needed to expose the fundamental flaws in the case against her. The October 2017 hearing where the forensic entomologist presented their findings was a watershed moment in the pursuit of justice. Judge Stephanie Miley of Clark County District Court listened to testimony from some of the world's leading experts in forensic entomology, each of whom independently reached the same scientifically irrefutable conclusion. Duran Bailey had died close in time to when his body was discovered, making Kirstin's involvement in his murder impossible. The hearing was emotional for everyone involved, but particularly for Kirstin's family members, who had never stopped believing in her innocence and never stopped fighting for her freedom. For 16 years, they had watched their daughter, sister, and friend waste away in prison for a crime they knew she did not commit. They had spent their savings on legal fees, their energy on advocacy, and their emotional resources on maintaining hope when the situation seemed hopeless. The prosecution's response to the scientific evidence was telling. Rather than acknowledging the obvious implications of the entomological findings, they attempted to discredit the science and the experts who presented it. They suggested that the entomological evidence was unreliable, that the experts were biased, and that their conclusions were speculative rather than scientifically sound. But their arguments rang hollow when faced with the unanimous conclusions of 3 independent experts, each of whom had decades of experience in forensic entomology and had testified in hundreds of criminal cases. The science was not speculative, it was based on well-established principles that had been validated through extensive research and practical application. The experts were not biased. They were applying objective scientific methods to clearly documented evidence. Judge Miley carefully considered all the evidence presented during the 5-day hearing, weighing the scientific testimony against the prosecution's arguments and examining the implications for Kirstin's conviction. Her decision, announced on December 19, 2017, was unequivocal. Kirstin's convictions were vacated based on ineffective assistance of counsel, specifically her trial attorney's failure to present the entomological evidence that could have prevented her wrongful conviction. The judge's reasoning was clear and compelling. The entomological evidence was not new science that had been developed after Kirstin's trials. It was established science that was available in 2001 when she was first convicted. Her defense attorneys had failed to consult with forensic entomologists, failed to examine this crucial aspect of the evidence, and failed to present scientific proof that could have established her innocence beyond any doubt. This failure constituted ineffective assistance of counsel under the 6th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees every defendant the right to competent legal representation. When defense attorneys fail to investigate and present evidence that could establish their client's innocence, they violate this fundamental right and create grounds for overturning the conviction. 10 days after Judge Miley's decision, on December 29, 2017, Clark County District Court Chief Judge Elizabeth Gonzalez took the extraordinary step of dismissing all charges against Kirstin Blaise Lobato. The dismissal came at the request of the Clark County District Attorney's Office, which finally acknowledged that the case against Kirstin could not be sustained in light of the scientific evidence. On January 3, 2018, after serving nearly 16 years in prison for a crime she did not commit, Kirstin Blaise Lobato walked out of prison a free woman. The moment was captured by news cameras and witnessed by family members and supporters who had never given up hope that this day would come. It was a moment of triumph, but also of profound sadness for the years that had been lost, the opportunities that had been missed, and the suffering that had been endured. Kirstin's release from prison was only the beginning of her journey toward full justice and vindication. In 2019, she filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the 2 detectives who had arrested her, Thomas Thousand and James La Rochelle. The lawsuit alleged that the detectives had fabricated evidence, ignored obvious inconsistencies in the case, and violated her constitutional rights through their reckless investigation. The civil trial, which began in December 2024, provided an opportunity for Kirstin to tell her story in full and to hold accountable those responsible for her wrongful conviction. The jury heard testimony about the rushed investigation, the misinterpreted statement, and the failure to pursue obvious alternative suspects who had both motive and opportunity to kill Duran Bailey. After deliberating for just one day, the federal jury returned a verdict that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. They awarded Kirstin $34 million in compensatory damages, the largest wrongful conviction settlement ever awarded to a woman in United States history. The jury also imposed $10,000 in punitive damages against each of the two detectives personally, emphasizing their individual responsibility for the misconduct that led to Kirstin's wrongful conviction. The verdict was more than just financial compensation. It was a complete vindication of Kirstin's innocence and a powerful statement about the consequences of police misconduct. The jury had heard all the evidence, examined all the facts, and concluded that Kirstin had been the victim of a fundamentally flawed investigation that violated her constitutional rights and destroyed 16 years of her life. Kirstin's emotional reaction to the verdict was captured by courtroom observers, who described her tears of relief and vindication. After more than 23 years of fighting for justice, she finally had not just her freedom, but also acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to her and compensation for the suffering she had endured. The case of Kirstin Blaise Lobato represents both the worst and the best of the American criminal justice system. It shows how confirmation bias, rushed investigations, and pressure to solve cases can lead to devastating wrongful convictions that destroy innocent lives. But it also demonstrates the power of scientific evidence to reveal truth, the importance of never giving up the fight for justice, and the possibility of redemption even in the most hopeless circumstances. Today, Kirstin works as an advocate for criminal justice reform and wrongful conviction awareness. She speaks at conferences, consults with legal organizations, and shares her story with law enforcement agencies to help prevent future wrongful convictions. Her experience has given her unique insights into the flaws in the system and the changes needed to ensure that what happened to her never happens to another innocent person. The case of Kirstin Blaise Lobato offers profound lessons about justice, perseverance, and the power of scientific truth that extend far beyond the specifics of her wrongful conviction. Her journey from teenage victim to wrongfully convicted prisoner to exonerated advocate represents one of the most powerful examples of resilience and redemption in modern criminal justice history. Perhaps the most important lesson from Kirstin's case is the critical role that objective scientific evidence plays in ensuring accurate criminal investigations. The forensic entomology evidence that ultimately freed her was not new science developed after her conviction. It was established methodology that was available throughout her 16 years of wrongful imprisonment. The tragedy is that this evidence was never examined until advocates familiar with forensic entomology became involved in her case. This highlights the need for defense attorneys to be familiar with all available forensic sciences and to consult with appropriate experts when the circumstances of a case suggest that specialized knowledge might be relevant. In too many cases, wrongful convictions occur not because the evidence of innocence does not exist, but because it is never discovered or properly presented. The legal system must do better at ensuring that defendants have access to competent scientific expertise when their freedom depends on it. The case also demonstrates the dangerous power of confirmation bias in criminal investigations. From the moment detectives received the third-hand rumor about Kirstin, they approached the case with the assumption that she was guilty rather than conducting an objective investigation into the facts. This bias colored every aspect of their work, from the leading questions they asked during her interview to their interpretation of her responses to their failure to investigate obvious alternative suspects. Law enforcement agencies must implement better training and oversight to prevent confirmation bias from deriving investigations. Detectives need to be taught to consider alternative explanations for evidence, to actively seek information that contradicts their initial theories, and to remain open to the possibility that their first impressions might be wrong. The pressure to solve cases quickly must never be allowed to override the obligation to investigate thoroughly and objectively. Another crucial lesson involves the treatment of sexual assault victims within the criminal justice system. Kirstin's wrongful conviction began with her survival of a sexual assault and her natural need to process that trauma by talking about it with family and friends. Instead of being treated as a crime victim deserving support and protection, she became a suspect based on misunderstandings about her account of defending herself against a rapist. This case highlights the need for better training about trauma responses, victim behavior, and the importance of distinguishing between survival accounts and criminal confessions. Sexual assault victims should never fear that seeking support or discussing their experiences will make them suspects in unrelated crimes. The system must do better at protecting and supporting victims, rather than victimizing them further. The 16 years that Kirstin spent in prison also demonstrate the incredible resilience of the human spirit when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite being surrounded by a system that insisted she was guilty, despite losing the prime years of her life to wrongful imprisonment, despite watching guilty people serve their sentences and regain their freedom while she remained trapped, Kirstin never gave up her fight for justice and never abandoned her insistence on her innocence. Her perseverance offers hope to other wrongfully convicted individuals and their families who may be facing similar struggles. It shows that even when the situation seems hopeless, even when appeals fail and options appear exhausted, truth has a way of eventually emerging if people refuse to give up the fight for justice. Scientific advances, legal developments, and changing circumstances can create new opportunities for vindication, even after many years have passed. The support that Kirstin received from her family and community throughout her ordeal also demonstrates the importance of believing and supporting those who maintain their innocence in the face of conviction. Her family never wavered in their belief that she was innocent, never stopped fighting for her freedom, and never abandoned their efforts to prove her innocence. This unwavering support was crucial to maintaining her emotional and psychological well-being during her long imprisonment. The eventual vindication also highlights the vital work being done by organizations like the Innocence Project and other advocates for the wrongfully convicted. These organizations provide essential legal expertise, scientific resources, and sustained advocacy that individual defendants and their families often cannot afford or access on their own. They represent the best hope for correcting wrongful convictions and preventing future miscarriages of justice. Finally, Kirstin's case demonstrates that true justice requires not just exoneration, but also accountability for those responsible for wrongful convictions. The $34 million jury award sends a powerful message that police misconduct and constitutional violations will have serious consequences. This kind of accountability is essential for deterring future misconduct and ensuring that law enforcement agencies take their obligations seriously. The transformation of Kirstin Blaise Lobato, from victim to survivor to advocate, represents the best possible outcome from a tragic situation. While nothing can return the 16 years she lost to wrongful imprisonment, her current work helping to prevent future wrongful convictions gives meaning to her suffering and helps ensure that other innocent people will not face the same ordeal. Her case reminds us that the pursuit of justice is not a destination but a journey, not a single moment but a sustained effort that requires vigilance, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to truth. It shows us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when the system fails catastrophically, the human spirit can endure and ultimately triumph. Most importantly, Kirstin's experience teaches us that we must never become complacent about the accuracy and fairness of our criminal justice system. Every wrongful conviction represents not just an individual tragedy but a systemic failure that demands our attention and our action. We must continue working to improve investigative practices, enhance legal representation, advance forensic science, and ensure that the pursuit of justice serves truth rather than convenience. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime cases that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the most mind-bending cases from around the world. The fight for justice continues, and together we can help ensure that truth prevails over assumption, that science triumphs over bias, and that innocent people like Kirstin Blaise Lobato receive the justice they deserve.